April 12, 1945, Baguio, Philippines. In the gray light of dawn, 24 Japanese women crouched in the mud of a hastily assembled compound. Their hands were pressed together, palms tight, fingers trembling, eyes squeezed shut. They weren't hoping for rescue. They were praying for death. The morning air was thick and cold, carrying faint echoes of voices, the distant shuffle of boots, and the metallic rattle of supplies being moved by unseen figures. Every step sounded like judgment, every heartbeat a drum of terror. These women had been trained to expect the worst, to see surrender as an ultimate disgrace. And now, trapped in this remote outpost, they awaited the final, inevitable punishment. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by these untold stories of war, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. From Manila to Tokyo, your support keeps these hidden chapters alive. A crunch of footsteps broke the tense silence, heads lifted cautiously, heavy boots pressed into the mud, deliberate, steady, echoing against the wooden beams and tattered canvas walls of the compound. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura's chest tightened. She whispered to the women to maintain composure, to hold to the code of the emperor, even as fear gnawed at her resolve. Images from propaganda films flashed through her mind. American soldiers portrayed as merciless, executioners, villages in flames, prisoners bayoneted without mercy. Every tale she had been told since joining the Imperial Army warned her of the horrors awaiting captured women. The boots halted. The compound gate swung open, but the Americans carried no rifles, no bayonets, no instruments of death. Instead, they brought crates stacked high, the scent of fresh wood, cloth, and supplies drifting faintly through the air. Blankets, food, medicine. The mundane seemed miraculous to the women. Their rigid expectations of cruelty collided violently with reality. For a suspended, breathless moment, the women in the mud glimpsed a truth that no textbooks would ever teach. The enemy could act with compassion. This was a story almost entirely absent from history. The names of these 24 Japanese women are mostly lost. The world barely remembers them. Yet what happened in these few weeks would challenge assumptions about war, propaganda, and the stubborn persistence of human decency even in the darkest moments. To understand why these women knelt in the mud expecting execution, we must rewind 6 months. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur's forces returned to the Philippines, fulfilling his promise to reclaim the islands. Japanese troops, spread thin across Luzon, scrambled to defend against the relentless American advance. Among roughly 30,000 soldiers, about 200 women served in hospitals, offices, communication units, and administrative posts. Military doctrine was clear. Surrender was shame. The Senjunkan, the imperial code, stated in no uncertain terms that a soldier captured alive had failed in duty. Officers carried cyanide capsules. Soldiers were trained to use grenades on themselves rather than face the disgrace of captivity. For women in uniform, the stakes were higher still. Propaganda painted the Americans as barbarians, brutal, rapacious, unforgiving. Newsreels depicted staged atrocities. Radio broadcasts recounted invented massacres, and officers repeated these stories until they became unquestioned truth. Fear was drilled into every thought. To be captured alive was not only dishonorable, it was a psychological punishment, an unending shame. By March 1945, the Japanese defensive lines in Baguio had collapsed. Most troops retreated into the mountains, engaging in desperate guerrilla campaigns. Yet a small group, nurses from a field hospital, 3 communications officers, several administrative staff, found themselves stranded, isolated from the main force. They hid in abandoned huts and caves for 3 weeks, surviving on foraged roots, wild plants, and water that tested even the hardiest stomachs. Exhaustion replaced fear. Capture arrived not with violence, but with the slow erosion of strength. Among them, Sergeant Macho Tanaka, 31, had served as a surgical nurse in Manchuria before her posting to the Philippines. She kept a diary, fragments of which survived the war. On March 28, she wrote, "No food, no medicine. Fumo's fever is high. At night we hear American patrols passing nearby. Each dawn I think it will be the end. Tomorrow, it ends." The dread was not of rifles or grenades, but of being discovered at the very edge of life. Unarmed and unprepared, the capture came quietly on April 1st. An American patrol stumbled upon the women in a collapsed warehouse on Baguio's outskirts. Private First Class Robert Chen, serving as interpreter, Recalled decades later, they huddled in a corner, shivering, pale, their torn uniforms clinging to emaciated frames. Some were barefoot. Their eyes widened in disbelief. They did not flee. They simply closed their eyes and prayed not for mercy, but for death. The Americans transported them to a temporary detention compound outside the city. It was far from a standard P camp, just a guarded perimeter, a few canvas tents, a water source. They were allocated a sleeping space and minimal rations, rice porridge twice daily, occasionally supplemented with dried fish. The young infantrymen of the 33rd Division had no experience with female prisoners. Most had never encountered Japanese women in uniform, let alone understood how to handle them. Orders were simple: secure the perimeter, prevent escape, maintain basic humanitarian standards in line with the Geneva Convention. But no order covered the women's refusal to eat, convinced that every meal was poisoned or a trap. For a week, the rations remained untouched. Hunger gnawed at them, but mistrust ran deeper. Fumiko Sato, 26, later recalled, "We felt like mice under a cat's gaze. Each day we waited, expecting the end. We could not imagine that mercy might exist." Outside, the world continued moving. Supply trucks rumbled past, ferrying food and ammunition to front lines. Inside, 24 women lingered in suspended terror, clinging to the beliefs drilled into them. For years, Americans took no prisoners, showed no mercy, and would only bring death. Then, on April 12th, the extraordinary unfolded. Captain William Morrison, 34, a former high school history teacher from Portland, visited the compound. He had fought through the Philippine archipelago, witnessed horrors few could imagine, and learned to compartmentalize the enemy as a target to be destroyed. Yet as he surveyed the emaciated, trembling figures before him, something stirred. These were not soldiers plotting resistance. They were women whose eyes had already seen death and assumed it inevitable. Private Chen explained, the women expected execution. They believed each meager portion of food was a trap. Morrison's gaze swept over the compound, and he made a choice no military manual had prepared him for. "Get me breakfast," he told his supply sergeant. "Everything we've got, real breakfast." Within an hour, crates arrived, the aroma of fresh bread, canned meat, fruit, coffee. Chocolate hit the compound first, before the men even opened the boxes. Corporal James Rodriguez, 22, watched as the women froze, disbelief etched in every face. One began crying, another joined. Tears filled the air like a sudden, unexpected storm. Sergeant Micho, cautious and deliberate, approached first. She picked up a can of corned beef, turned it in her hands, then looked at Morrison. Private Chen translated her question. "Is it poisoned?" Morrison cut the can himself, tasted it, and returned it. "It's real. You're not going to die today." Slowly, the women moved forward, taking food in careful, deliberate bites. Some ate on the muddy ground, others carried portions to the sick. 19-year-old Yuki Harada held a chocolate bar like a sacred object. Through an interpreter, she said later, "I thought I was dreaming. I thought I had died. I couldn't understand why our enemies were feeding us." This was the first crack in the barrier of propaganda and fear. Compassion, humanity, and survival had collided in the mud of Baguio. And it was only the beginning. The first bites of food were only the beginning. Over the following days, the compound gradually transformed from a grim holding area into a place where survival, and something resembling trust, became possible. Captain Morrison, refusing to let bureaucracy or field manuals dictate morality, requisitioned medical supplies, improved sleeping conditions, and ensured a clean water supply. Canvas replaced the mud underfoot, and army medics treated the sick. Fumiko's pneumonia improved within days, her fever finally subsiding under the careful hands of both American doctors and Sergeant Mitiko, who consulted on treatments and shared her own knowledge from years as a nurse. In these small, deliberate acts, a fragile bridge formed across an immense divide. The women began to eat regularly. Color returned to their faces, and slowly, their postures shifted from the rigid, prayerful crouch of captives to the cautious acknowledgement of life. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura, once the highest-ranking officer among them, grappled with an unfamiliar sensation. Disbelief mingled with gratitude. How could these Americans, painted as monsters for 3 years of relentless propaganda, show such care? How could they, the enemy, tend to her wounds and bring her sustenance without expecting submission or betrayal in return? The Americans, too, struggled with their own contradictions. Corporal James Rodriguez found himself debating quietly with Private Eddie Walsh during quiet moments of the day. "We're supposed to kill them on the battlefield," Walsh said, shaking his head. "But here we are, feeding them, treating them, being kind. Where's the line?" Rodriguez paused, watching Sergeant Mitico assist a medic in cleaning wounds. "Maybe there isn't a line," he said softly. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe war doesn't erase humanity, it just tests it." Over the next 3 days, the transformation within the compound became tangible. The women, once skeletal, cautious, and terrorized, began moving with intent, helping one another, sharing morsels, and cautiously interacting with the soldiers. 19-year-old Yuki Harada, the youngest of the group, held a chocolate bar like a sacred object, savoring it. Slowly, through her interpreter, she later reflected, "I thought I had died and this was an afterlife. I couldn't understand why our enemies were feeding us." Her words were echoed in the quiet nods and tears of others, a shared acknowledgement of disbelief, relief, and a growing awareness that the world was not as black and white as they had been taught. Food was only the first act of compassion. Captain Morrison ensured that medical attention continued. Army medics administered sulfa drugs for Fumiko and treated minor infections in others. Blankets and clean clothing replaced tattered uniforms. A water purification unit provided safe drinking water, dramatically reducing the risk of dysentery. The compound, once a symbol of confinement, became a functioning refuge, a place where the women could recover, both physically and psychologically. As their bodies healed, so too did their perceptions of the enemy. Lieutenant Yoshiko struggled the most. Trained to maintain discipline, uphold honor, and lead her peers according to a rigid code, she now confronted a reality that challenged every lesson she had been taught. The Americans who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who had committed atrocities across Asia according to her indoctrination, were teaching her basic English words, tending to her wounds, and showing an unexpected patience. She questioned her definition of honor, her understanding of leadership, and even the very meaning of courage. In time, the women and the soldiers began small exchanges. The Japanese women taught basic Japanese phrases to the Americans, while the Americans reciprocated with English lessons. Stories were shared cautiously at first, short accounts of family, childhood, memories, and experiences of war, but soon, the barriers of fear and suspicion began to dissolve. Sergeant Mitiko, the former nurse, found her knowledge respected and valued. She advised medics on care and treatment, and her input was immediately applied. The American soldiers realized that knowledge could be shared without conflict, that expertise did not belong exclusively to one side of the war. Practical collaboration also emerged. Lieutenant Yoshiko consulted with Captain Morrison on logistical matters, where to dig latrines, how to organize sleeping areas, and how to manage the daily operations of the compound. These were not ideological debates, but matters of common sense, highlighting the humanity that could persist even amid the machinery of war. One afternoon in early May, a sudden tropical downpour drove everyone to seek shelter. Private Yuki Harada found herself huddled under a tarp with 3 American soldiers. Rain sheets fell in relentless torrents, drumming on canvas and mud alike. For 20 minutes, there was no enemy, no soldier, no prisoner, just people sharing space beneath the same sky. Someone passed a pack of Lucky Strikes, and a quiet, fragile camaraderie emerged. As the storm eased, Yuki looked at the soldiers and whispered in halting English, "Same rain, same sky." One of the soldiers, Private Danny O'Brien, nodded softly. "Yeah, same rain." It was a fleeting moment, almost forgettable, yet monumental, a crack in the rigid truths imposed by propaganda, a glimpse of the world as it truly was. By late May, the military situation in the Philippines had stabilized. Japanese forces were scattered, cut off from supplies and command. On May 8th, Germany surrendered, though news traveled slowly to remote posts like the Baguio compound. The Pacific theater continued, but there was a sense that the war was nearing its conclusion. Orders soon arrived. The women would be transferred to a larger P facility in Manila. Their temporary sanctuary, the compound where fear and compassion had collided, would be dismantled. The fragile, extraordinary community that had formed would dissolve. The night before their transfer, Captain Morrison gathered the women and, through Private Chen, explained what lay ahead: medical care, proper facilities, eventual repatriation to Japan. The women listened in silence, absorbing the news cautiously. Finally, Sergeant Mitchell spoke. Chen translated. She asked if Captain Morrison would accompany them to Manila. He shook his head. No, my unit is moving in a different direction. Maiko nodded slowly and offered a deep, formal bow. One by one, the other women mirrored her gesture. It was not submission but recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the humanity that had carried them through the darkest weeks. Morrison returned the bow awkwardly. You deserve to be treated like human beings, he said. I'm glad we could do that much. The following morning, trucks arrived. As the women prepared to depart, they said their goodbyes to the soldiers who had nurtured them from the brink of death. Lieutenant Yoshiko shook Captain Morrison's hand. You showed us, she said in careful English, that everything we were told was wrong. Morrison nodded. Maybe that's the real victory, he replied. In that moment, he understood something profound. The enemy was human, capable of honor and compassion, and that recognition had transformed all of them. The women arrived in Manila on May 12th, processed into a larger facility housing hundreds of Japanese prisoners, both military and civilian. Barracks replaced tents, proper infirmaries replaced makeshift care, and organized mess halls replaced sporadic rations. Yet something vital was lost: the intimacy of the small Baguio compound. The daily gestures that had humanized both sides gave way to the impersonal routines of institutional life. Though safe physically, the psychological transformation continued. Many of the women were still haunted by fear, mistrust, and years of indoctrination. Nightmares, hesitation, and disbelief remained part of daily life, reminding them that recovery was not simply a matter of food or shelter, but a painstaking process of reclaiming humanity. Even within this larger facility, the seeds planted in Baguio, the recognition of shared humanity, the small acts of kindness, the teaching of languages continued to grow. Bonds, tentative at first, endured. For Lieutenant Yoshiko, Sergeant Midako, and Private Yuki, the lessons of the Baguio compound would shape their understanding of the world long after the war ended. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, the war in the Philippines was drawing to a close. Japanese defensive positions had collapsed, remaining forces scattered across mountains, isolated, and without supplies. The surrender of Germany on May 8th had little immediate impact on the remote Baguio and Manila posts, but it marked the inexorable approach of the war's conclusion. Within the Manila facility, the women from Baguio were adjusting to institutional routines, barracks, mess halls, and medical care replacing the chaos of their temporary compound. While their bodies recovered, their minds carried the lingering shadows of fear, disbelief, and trauma. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura, once defined entirely by her rank and her military identity, faced the most profound challenge. For years, she had been trained to lead, uphold honor, and enforce the rigid codes of the Imperial Army. But in Manila, surrounded by both Japanese civilians and American soldiers who had shown her compassion, she found her understanding of duty and honor upended. Every act of kindness, the feeding, the medical care, the patience, was a living contradiction to everything she had been taught. How could the enemy demonstrate greater honor than her own commanders? She spent long hours in the small facility library, reading Japanese texts, reflecting, and slowly reconstructing a sense of self outside of uniform and propaganda. 19-year-old Private Yuki Harada adapted most natural. Barely out of girlhood, she had not been as heavily conditioned by military ideology. She quickly befriended civilian prisoners, continued learning English, and even began teaching Japanese to some of the American nurses. Where Lieutenant Yoshiko wrestled with disbelief, Yuki sought opportunity. She was determined to build something new from the fragments of fear and indoctrination. Her perspective, shaped less by propaganda and more by lived experience, became a quiet beacon within the facility. Nurse Fumiko Sato, who had survived pneumonia, confronted nightmares that returned her mentally to the Baguio compound in her dreams. The Americans alternated between saviors and monsters, the duality of her training clashing with the reality she had witnessed. She would awaken in cold sweat, disoriented, unsure which reality was true. Captain Eleanor Hayes, an Army psychologist observing the facility, documented her case along with others. Many female Japanese prisoners exhibit severe cognitive dissonance. Their lived experience directly contradicts the conditioning instilled by military training. For these women, recovery was as much mental as physical, and the process would take years, not weeks. By mid-August, the war reached its historic end. Emperor Hirohito's radio announcement of Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, was met with a mix of relief, grief, disbelief, and confusion among the women. For some, surrender was incomprehensible. For others, a long-awaited cessation of terror. Sergeant Mitiko wept quietly, tears streaming down her face, uncertain whether she grieved defeat, celebrated survival, or mourned the years lost to conflict. In that moment, thoughts of Captain Morrison and the Americans who had fed and cared for her returned. They had won more than the war. They had demonstrated that humanity could persist even amid destruction. Repatriation required months of preparation. The women from Baguio remained in Manila, writing letters home and unsure of what they could truthfully communicate. In November 1945, they were finally placed on a U.S. Navy transport bound for Japan. Lieutenant Yoshiko, boarding the vessel, was asked by Captain Hayes what she intended to tell her countrymen. Her answer reflected her profound transformation. The enemy taught me more about honor than my own commanders ever did. 12 days later, they arrived at Uraga Harbor. Japan was in ruins, cities were burned, food was scarce, and hope was tenuous. Returning home proved to be a different kind of challenge than captivity had been. Sergeant Micho found her Hiroshima village partially destroyed. Though her family had survived, her mother urged discretion regarding the events of the war. Yet Micho could not remain silent. She worked in a clinic, recounting the story of the American officer who had fed and cared for them. When they had expected death, some doubted her account. One elderly doctor remarked, "Perhaps rebuilding begins not with weapons, but with empathy." Lieutenant Yoshiko reunited with her husband, a naval officer who had fought against the Americans while she had come to see them as human beings. Their early conversations were strained, steeped in opposing experiences of the war. Yet, over time, exhaustion and the shared desire for peace became a common ground. Slowly, understanding replaced suspicion, and a fragile bridge of reconciliation emerged. Private Yuki, still only 20, confronted the lasting trauma of war but found purpose in education. She began teaching English in Yokohama, often telling her students that her lessons had been learned from the enemy, showing that those once considered adversaries could become teachers and mentors. Through her work, she sought to transform fear and indoctrination into understanding and growth. In 1947, 15 of the 24 women reunited in Tokyo over a modest meal. They away, and the gatherings dwindled, yet the lessons endured, carried forward in their lives and those they touched. In 1982, historian Thomas Nakamura interviewed Michiko, now 73, reflecting on the long shadow cast by the Baguio events. Showing her diary, she said, "The Americans brought us food. How do we make sense of enemies who feed us? The worst lies teach us to see others as less than human." Her words encapsulated the lasting impact of the experience, that fear and propaganda could warp perception, but small acts of kindness and courage could restore humanity. Captain Morrison, long retired, recalled his part in these events simply, "We gave them breakfast, no medals, no headlines, only a small stone in Tokyo, a quiet testament to what is possible when humanity survives war." His statement, concise yet profound, underlined the theme that had defined the Baguio episode. It was never about fame or recognition. It was about proving that even in the darkest circumstances, compassion, empathy, and dignity could endure. The Baguio story, largely absent from textbooks, remains a rare example of how individual choices can disrupt cycles of violence. The actions of a few Americans, guided by conscience rather than orders, challenged deeply ingrained propaganda and reshaped the understanding of captives who had been taught to see all enemies as inhuman. The women of Baguio returned home scarred yet enlightened, carrying the paradoxical truth that humanity could thrive even amidst the machinery of war. By the time the last of the women left the Manila facility, their lives had been irrevocably altered. They had survived, not only through endurance, but through the courage of those willing to defy expectation and do the right thing. Their story reminds us that even in total war, human decency is not lost. It can persist, quietly, subtly, and with profound consequences. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with others who appreciate history's hidden chapters. Drop a comment below and tell us what lesson from these women's experience resonates with you. Every view helps keep these untold stories alive.